You're at virtual book signing, and as usual, I'm Daniel Weinberg at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. It's a beautiful day out there, and I think people are enjoying it, or Friday, trying to get away. But we appreciate that you're with us today and watching live with us. If you have any questions that you want to ask during our show while we're live, please feel free to email them in. Give us your first name and where you're from, and we'll shout out to you and appreciate all of that. If you're watching on our archive and wish to get a book, perhaps we might have a first edition signed still left, so do call or email into the shop. And if you've never left your emails with us, please do so so that we can remind you of upcoming shows later on. But we appreciate your being here today at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop and virtual book signing. Today we're very proud to have Stephen L. Carter with us, William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law at Yale University since 1982, but who's counting? He's a frequent contributor to the Daily Beast and to Newsweek. He writes a column for the Bloomberg View, and he's the author of 8 nonfiction books, including The Violence of Peace, America's Wars in the Age of Obama, God's Name in Vain, The Wrongs and Rights of Religion and Politics, Civility, The Confirmation Mess, Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby, and others. His most well-known novel is The Emperor of Ocean Park, his first. But today, we are featuring his 5th novel, The Impeachment of Abraham Lincoln, a novel. Produced by Knopf, 512 pages, and it's $26.95, and be happy to get you 1 or 7 copies signed, so let us know if you have an interest. I've handled a copy of Theodore Roosevelt's Wilderness Hunter years ago, in which he inscribed that amongst the books I've had, this is the one that I like best. Then, some years later, I got in a letter of his to someone else saying another book was his favorite. So, which one is your favorite? Not the one we're flogging today, but what is your favorite book of the ones you've written?
It's a hard question to answer because I don't go back and read my books usually after I've written them. But I think I would divide the nonfiction and the fiction in the following way. I think of my nonfiction books, I don't know it's my favorite, but the one that meant the most to me, the one that when I look back on it, I still think it pressed a point that is nearest and dearest to my heart and also crucial for today, is a book I published a few years ago entitled Civility, Manners, Morals, and the Etiquette of Democracy, a book about how we think about and talk about and to each other. Of my novels, I can't say which is my favorite novel, but the new one was the most fun to write. I always do a lot of research. I always have a lot of fun. This one was the most fun by far in the writing.
Well, we consider history fun, so we're not surprised. Give us a sense, first of all, tell us, in our audience, how did you get to this novel? Why this novel now?
I've been a Lincoln buff, an amateur to be sure, but a Lincoln buff for a very long time, and my earliest memories of wondering what would have happened if Lincoln had survived the assassination are of chatting with a professor and some other students after a history class when I was undergraduate at Stanford a long, long time ago, almost 40 years ago now. So that idea has always been percolating around in the back of my mind, the idea of wondering what would have happened. The idea of setting it in a novel had to wait until I thought I had characters and a story that were worth telling, that I could set against the background of an impeachment trial of this president who I so admire and who I suspect that those who were watching and listening also so admire. The coalescing into a story that could be told probably happened about 4 or 5 years ago, and that took about 4 years to write the book.
And fun, as you said. Well, do you have a literary style? Have you evolved something that you can yourself feel as you?
I'm not the one to answer that. What I would say is this, that although I'm a law professor, and my profession, if you will, is that, as a legal teacher and a legal scholar. So when I write fiction, And in addition to novels, I've published a number of short stories. I do it for the fun of it. I really do it. It exercises a different part of my mind. And so when I take on Lincoln in fiction, I'm not taking him on as a scholar who's interested in the war power, although I'm interested in the war power. I'm taking him on just as someone who's trying to have a good time and help the reader have a good time. And really I think that more than anything else, I'm committed to that I want readers to have a good time. I do want my stories to make sense. I want them to have mystery and clues and things like that. But I want them to be fun for the reader, but I also want them to be well researched. In the novels I've written, a number have taken a lot of research. One, for example, took place in the 50s and 60s, and Richard Nixon is a major character. That took a lot of work. This was by far the most research I had to do for one of my novels, but doing the research is really a joy.
Well, there are, as we were talking before our show here, innumerable Lincoln and Civil War alternative history novels. We had Seth Grahame-Smith on virtual book signing with his Vampire Hunter book.
Quite an alternative history.
Exactly. Well, someone emailed in while we were live. Is this true? So it could happen today, too. We'll find out. Here we have a few books in our stock that are always available. This is one of my favorites. For Want of a Nail, Washington, if Burgoyne had won at Saratoga. For Want of a Nail, Paul Revere, who had 5 rides, invoiced all of them, and threw a shoe and didn't make it. And all those traitors like Washington and Patrick Henry were hanged, and we went on as a colony. An End to Bugling by Edmund Love is a terrific little book.
I don't know that one. I'm familiar with this one, although I haven't read it. I'm not familiar with that one.
This is from the Centennial, and he puts Jeb Stuart on a ride. All of a sudden, something happens. Boom! There's Jeb Stuart and his cavalry riding near Washington, going up to Gettysburg. And he doesn't understand why all these Union people are out there cheering him on. Well, they're looking at reenactors. So that's what that is. And then your predecessor, The Lost Years, that Lewis did many years ago, also by Knopf. So maybe Knopf doesn't like real history. That's an interesting thought. I've seen it. So here's another one that's very good.
In The Lost Years, Lincoln doesn't get impeached. He has a successful term and lives happily ever after.
That's right, exactly.
And so on.
A much easier one to write, perhaps. Have you always been into alternative history, then, as you were saying?
Well, no, it's interesting. And I didn't actually originally think of this as alternative history, although it obviously is. I didn't think of the genre. I just thought of the story. That is, for me, it was just a matter of wondering, and finally being able to set a story about this. And I think what makes it different from some of the others is a lot of the Lincoln novels that are out there are novels in which either Lincoln is the principal character, or at least the story is told by someone who's very close to Lincoln, has easy access to power, to the seat of power, and so on. Whereas for me, Lincoln is only in 7 scenes in the novel.
I noticed.
And I was more interested in telling the story from the point of view of an outsider, and it was that outsider perspective that generated the story. My protagonist, a 21-year-old black woman named Abigail Canner, from whose point of view most of the story is told, really generated the actual narrative and forward momentum in the story.
I want to go back again to the technique for a moment. These are innumerable smaller chapters that go on. And I found myself, first of all, you have so many characters in there that you're juggling them throughout these various chapters. But it seems that it has a push of its own and continue on its own. And you don't have to look to 17 more pages in this chapter. It just kind of keeps going and draws you on. Was that a technique?
I don't know if it's technique, but it's very flattering. I mean, that's certainly what any author would hope for. My idea in writing the story was that although it's historical fiction, and as you say, alternative history, it still in that sense, I suppose, follows the rules of what you would think of as a thriller or a courtroom drama, in the sense that there should be a sense of forward momentum. The reader shouldn't have to do a lot of work. The reader should be wanting to find out what happens next. So if that worked, I'm glad to hear it.
Now, from the innumerable people that populate the Civil War era, how did you decide upon whom you were going to use as characters like Daniel Sickles or Augustus Belmont? Maybe he was easy. How did you sift through them all in your research and say, you're interesting and you're Dustin?
It was very hard because there are so many fascinating characters in the era, people I couldn't find room for in the book. So, for example, I wanted to find room for Frederick Douglass in the book. I really, really did. And I just, in the end, the way the story worked out, there just wasn't room for all the people I wish I could have talked about in detail. Salmon Chase, for me, one of the most fascinating characters of the era, the Secretary of Treasury, the Chief Justice, who then tried to run for president from the Supreme Court. He's kind of hovering in the background in a few scenes. I hoped to make him more central, but there just wasn't room. In the end, it was the demands of the story that limited the scope of which characters. I didn't by any means get all the people who fascinated me most, but I did include among the real people in the novel those that I thought helped the story move along the best.
You alluded to your main protagonist, a young African-American woman. And initially, to me, it seemed so 21st century. And I had a little bit of trouble getting through that. That she would be where she was and were able to get into places where she was, I moved through it and it worked for me. How did you choose thusly? I mean, is she a symbol for something else? What is she based on?
Well, the first thing I should say is that a lot of people had that reaction, and that's one of the reasons I chose her as a character, because there was a significant black middle class, a class of people who had been free sometimes for several generations at the time of the Civil War, and that's a story that's not told very much. So setting my protagonist in that milieu was actually a conscious choice in part. And if you look at it, what's interesting about that era is that there were about 7 or 8 black lawyers at the time. We don't know the exact number. There were no female lawyers, although the first woman to try to sit for the bar, Myra Bradwell, not only tried for the first time, the following year, in 1868, was the first time that she tried. So it was not unreasonable that a young woman could imagine being admitted to the bar in a few years. There were black college-educated women at the time. A lot of them had gone to Oberlin, where Abigail goes at the time. So that all is plausible. The other thing is that, especially among younger people in Washington, there was a bit of integration at the time, even of social settings and things like that. It was not... So, for example, there's a scene in the novel where she goes to the theater with a young white man. That would not have been considered particularly scandalous at the time. People actually did that in Washington. Thaddeus Stevens, one of the great and eloquent radical Republicans, abolitionists today, his common law wife was a black woman. They lived together till the day that he died. So it was not as unusual, I think, as people sometimes think.
Well, it was only 150 years ago. What was life, briefly, what was life like for the middle-class African-American family?
Well, first, I should make clear that, of course, that
she would have come from.
The great majority of black people at the time were just out of the horrible ravages of slavery. Those who were free, some were one generation free. They typically bought their freedom because in most of the southern states, slaves, in addition, if they got their work done for their master, they could work on the side and get a little money, and that was how a lot of people bought their freedom. But some families have been free for several generations. It was still a hard life in the sense there were a lot of official and unofficial discriminations. There were a lot of hotels and restaurants that didn't serve black people, for example, even in the North. But there was already underway this process of constructing a kind of separate society, a world in which relatively privileged, and I use the word relatively, black people could have their own clubs and hotels and restaurants and so on. Most of the families were not professional families, the middle class background. It was someone who had a trade, a blacksmith, a farmer, or something like that. But there was a growing number of professionals, not only lawyers, but doctors, pharmacists. Being a pharmacist was a very prestigious profession at that time. And, of course, as well, undertakers. The profession was just getting started in those days and was very lucrative.
That Lincoln, out here in Illinois, was himself, he and Mary, were emerging into a fairly new middle class. Middle class was kind of new at that moment. And they were coming into it as well. As new folks.
The middle class was new. It's seen as a product of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of professionals, of people who earned their money because of a particular field of study they'd entered into over a period of time. That was a new phenomenon in the 19th century. It was new in the United States. It was new in England. It was new on the continent. We're actually on the continent. It barely existed. Then it was an American phenomenon earlier than anything else. And interestingly, it's around that time that construction became a lucrative trade as these middle-class families began to build houses. Before that, there were the houses people built themselves, and there were the vast mansions of the rich. And the notion of a middle-class family owning a house, a made out of brick, stout manse, as they were all called, even the small ones, on a street somewhere, was fairly new, and that gave rise to a whole new generation of people who earn money building houses. So the professionals actually were good for the rest of America.